This is We Burlesque.
The following episode of the Movies That Made We, Ooky Spooky will contain spoilers for all of the films referenced in the show notes. Additionally, discussion may include triggers for trauma due to the provocative nature of horror media, not limited to sexual abuse, racism, ableism, homo and transphobia, violence, self-harm, and animal death. Corresponding clips of these films may feature visually distressing content.
Bella La Blanc, would you please tell the folks at home and us as well what your second film is?
All right, my second film. So my second film is Lady in White. It was released in 1988. It is originally based off of old urban legend and folklore from the Northeast. All right, so I remember watching this as a kid, late night, HBO, like you stayed up way too late and it showed at like 2 a.m. when you suddenly watched it. Then you watch it later on in life and you're like, holy fuck, I watched that. And you might not have fully digested it, but then you did. And for some reason, like, you're like, God, I remember this like movie I watched when I was younger and it had this floating shadow figure and ever seen a dream walking? Well, I did. By the way, if you decide to watch this movie, content warning. Possible racism and child death. It takes place in the 1960s. And it's, there's a lot to unpack there. So it starts off with an author coming back to his hometown up in the Northeast. He comes home to visit. He goes and he visits like these gravestones of a mother and a daughter. And this guy's like, oh, do you really believe all this stuff? And blah, 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 blah. And he's like, yeah, whatever, F off, dude. And he goes back home. Well, turns out you go back in time and it's this kid. It's him as a kid. And he's in school and it's him growing up. Turns out this kid's not too popular. He's been bullied and yada, yada. And he winds up getting like pushed into this locker and yada, yada. And all of a sudden he sees like this shadowy figure and this little girl, this beautiful little angelic, bubbly, giggly figure. Did you ever see a dream walking? Well, I did. And all of a sudden this little fucking ghosty shadow figure gets choked the fuck out and she croaks. Gets carried off. Taken off, and all of a sudden, this kid gets fucking attacked, and he hides in the sewer grate, and he's almost killed. This kid gets almost unalived. All right. Don't know what happens. This whole freaking thing happens. Turns out this janitor, who is a black man in the 1960s, is accused of all of it. So this is where all this comes in. Turns out he didn't do it. This whole hoopla comes on. He's proven to be not guilty. They still kill him. It's fucking disgusting. But then you go later on and you find out, like, I don't want to give too much of a spoilers because I don't know if this is a spoiler review or okay. Turns out it's the guy's like, it's like a family member's best friend. And like this dude's been killing all these other guys. And it's just, but it's all based off of an urban legend. And it's about this lady's house on a hill. And this guy's like killed off supposedly all these kids in the area. And every night at midnight, this little girl, this little beautiful shadowy figure that wanders around, goes to this school, gets yeeted and murdered at the school and yeeted off a cliff. And all of a sudden you see this beautiful white lady in white come down and jump off the cliff. It's the mother. And it's the whole story of supposedly how this all happened and the author that wrote the story. And it's just twists and turns. And I remember so much of this movie embedded in my brain. Namely, one, just the whole thing of, have you ever seen a dream walking? And for the 80s, how they did this with like the shadowy graphics. Like they were ahead of their time. And the funny thing is, it had so much great ratings and like the critics were off the, but it was a box office flop.
It was All Hallows Eve, and I, still locked behind the cloakroom door, suddenly felt a wind sweep through the darkness, chilling me to the bone.
my present? Where did you hide it this time? Of course I know who gave me this dress. You did. I know your favorite song, too. Have you ever seen a dream walking? Well, I did. Did you ever hear a dream talking? Well, I did. Because you're always singing it, that's how I know. Did you ever see a dream? Who are you? Now. No, I don't want to play anymore. I want my mommy. I want to go home.
I did a quick cursory glance over. You're right. It did have a very positive critical response due to the styling and the way that it was, like the pacing of it. For 1988, it does seem to be a pastiche type film. So it was maybe not what people were expecting in 1988 when they had things like the blood and gore more respectably available.
Yeah, that people wanted slasher, and this wasn't. This was more of a murder mystery, and that was the thing. Like they
Gothic
wanted
horror is tough sell sometimes.
Yeah, and that's the thing. That's definitely what this was, and it was also a period piece. It was 1960s, and it was a 1960s film in the 80s. And the thing is, you can't really sell the 60s and the 80s. You could sell the 50s, you could sell the 40s. You couldn't really sell the 60s. And that was the one thing I guess that they were trying to go with. I'm not sure, but I mean, I was a kid and I liked it. At least I remember liking it. And then I saw it again, maybe like 2 years ago. I watched it over COVID because I remember just, we're all stuck in our COVID funk and we're like reliving our youth, I guess, and our depression of our COVID bubble going, what? And then I just had this, I remembered, I was like, why is this stuck in my head? And I started like Googling and I was like, oh yeah, Lady in White. God, I remember watching that so many times when I was a kid, and I watched it and I was like, this movie was actually, yes, it had its like woo moment, but it was really good for what it was, especially for like made in the 80s. Like it was, especially how it was done, like the pacing, it didn't really have any like slow parts, if that makes any sense. And how it all added up. And I'm kind of sad nobody here watched it, which makes me kind of sad. And I wish I picked a different movie that somebody.
No, of course. No, this is why we do this, to also expose people to films that they may not have already experienced. The problem with streaming services being as fractured as they are is who knows who owns the rights to this, because this isn't available streaming anywhere.
But I also know you can watch it on YouTube. I do know that you can actually watch it on YouTube. It is definitely but remember, it's graphics for the 1980s, but it's actually pretty ahead of its time in regards to like graphics and stuff. Like I said, like you just see it's obvious that it's a ghost. It's shadowy, and then like you think you see a ghost, but it's really someone's sister. And now I don't want to spoil it because there's a bunch of people that probably haven't seen it. But if anybody knows of the urban legend of the Lady in White, this supposedly gives you what the supposed backstory might have been. Okay. Obviously false, but it's someone's take of what a backstory of the Lady in White could have been based off of this author's perspective. And I really enjoyed it. I'm so sorry for anybody. They Disney-fied the shit out of the ending. But I mean, it was 80s. It was in the 80s. You had your fucking Disney endings. But honestly, it's definitely one of those, if you want a quintessential completely like off the radar, you want to have like a complete, like no one might know that you've seen this 1980s horror murder mystery film, definitely recommend Lady in White.
The Lady in White legend does exist in most every culture. There is a version of or also referred to as the White Lady. Usually has to do with a woman who has had some sort of tragic end. This is also an additional, probably a precursor to like the 1950s bunny hop prom queen left on the side of the road
Yes.
who never got picked up by her prom date, things like that. Usually our signs or story is about accidental death, murder, suicide. Many people who are also familiar with La Llorona should also be familiar with that as a vague parallel.
Yeah, that was their take on it.
Yeah.
That was because I mean they were like, oh, urban legend, let's run with it before like it became like a big fad.
Yeah.
So it's kind of cute as like a late 80s early intro into like people's real urban legend, which I took it. I was like, I mean, how old was I? 1988. I was in single digit numbers. I don't want to say how many single digit numbers, but I was in single digit numbers.
Well, it's one of those. It's just like the Man in the Hat or the Shadow People. It's a woman in white is a very frequent apparition that people witness. Do any of you have a sighting or an experience where you saw and then compared notes and somebody else said, I've seen something like that?
As a kid, I saw weird shit all the time. I lived in Florida. I grew up in Florida. I mean, we saw weird shit on the beach on the beach late at night all the time.
I was talking to because I've done ghost story segments with burlesque people before. They're just incredibly hard to schedule, so I haven't done one this season. But check out Burlesque Ghost Stories on We Burlesque podcast, and the concept of the Man in the Hat or the Slender Man type figure, very common to the point where it is just a part of you're sort of like the concept of like the sleep paralysis demon. It's just something that you see. We don't know what's going on all of the layers of the universe. I buy it. We're seeing something.
Like growing up, we all would compare notes, like late night on the beach. Like growing up in Florida, we all would hang out on the beach. And how many of us would be like, so who's seen blah, blah, blah on the beach? And like a lot of us, we always would see stuff late night all the way out in the ocean. Like we always would see stuff and we always would compare notes, be like, yep, we saw it. Yep, we saw it. It just normal occurrence. Just it's a thing.
Willow, you live in a very historical area. Have you seen anything?
I live in the Richmond area, but I live in like the suburbs, like
Richmond.
Richmond, Virginia. Like I'm like 2 hours south of you, it sounds like, based on what you were. Yeah, we're practically neighbors.
We Burlesque the podcast, bringing friends together.
Sorry, what was your question, Victor? We were too busy.
Have you seen any ghosts, Willow? God damn it.
Yeah, no, I haven't. I live in the suburbs where like my house is from the 90s. Like it's not old.
There are 90s ghosts, I'm sure.
There are, but it's not like I don't have any like
I was drowned by my governess. No, you don't have any of that.
Yes. No, I don't have any from down here. When I was a kid, when I lived in Vermont, we lived in an old late 1800s, early 1900s farmhouse that we were convinced was haunted. I was very young, and so I don't remember a lot of it, but I know like my mom swears she heard somebody playing music when nobody else was home, things like that. Like just like weird little occurrences like that.
Little bleeds in the time space, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, my story is on the We Burlesque podcast, Burlesque Ghost Stories. So if you would like to hear, where I also lived in a converted farmhouse but in Durham, Connecticut, I tell my tale in one of those episodes. So check that out. Let's move on, Willow, to your second film.
So my second film, we're talking about growing up in Vermont and about Connecticut, actually takes place in Connecticut. It is Beetlejuice. And the exterior shots were filmed just a couple of miles from where I grew up in Vermont. And much like the Addams, I think most goth and spooky inclined humans of about our age were very into Tim Burton in our youth. He's turns out kind of problematic, but that's we didn't know that then. But yeah, no, I loved Beetlejuice as a kid. I always found it a little confusing because there was the movie, but then there was also the Beetlejuice cartoon in which Lydia and Beetlejuice were like BFFs and like went on adventures together. And then I'd watch the movie where he was the titular character, but also definitely the antagonist. But I was thinking about, with the musical out recently, which if you haven't listened to the cast recording, I highly recommend watch a bootleg if you can find it. Go see it on Broadway if you can afford it. I mean, that musical has that show. Nope. That movie has been on my mind a lot lately. And I was thinking about sort of the way the Maitlands, the couple that dies at the beginning of Beetlejuice, how they had the house and how it was this sort of like perfect country home with all these warm woods and these like sort of floral wallpapers and all in these very like warm tones. And it makes me think like our house was never that put together, right? We could afford it because it was run down. And we just never had that kind of money to like fix it up properly. But it was the same kind of vibe, right? Like we still had all that same woodwork that was the old part of the house. I very distinctly remember that our kitchen, all the kitchen decor was those like stupid fucking geese with the blue ribbon. Like it was very country. And it was a very... Did you have
those tin Jello molds on the wall?
I don't think so. I think my mom hated Jello enough.
Well, we never used them, but Joyce would have them in the house. Like we had a fish, we had like all different, for some reason it was a very popular, you can even see it in Golden Girls. It must be a generational thing.
Yeah, no, I do. I know the tins you're talking about. We just didn't have them. No, we had a wood burning stove in the kitchen, and my mom still to this day really loves what I tend to think of as like a country style table where it's just the shape of the legs. It's like the wooden legs and like, or the wooden tabletop and then the white legs, or I don't know. It was very, very country. And that was a popular style, right? It was popular in the countryside. It was something that I saw at a lot of my friends' homes. It was something obviously that I saw at my home. The Maitland's version of it in the movie was much more cleaned up and much more upper class, right? Like I lived in a working community where everyone was either a dairy farmer or worked in a granite quarry. But that aesthetic was very familiar, and I did not like it that much. And so, and not that I like actively had opinions about home decor at, the age of 10 or whatever I was, but it didn't speak to me. It didn't mean anything to me. And I remember even as a kid, when the Dietzes come in and the house gets this makeover with all of Delia's weird art and the walls are painted gray and all the woodwork is painted over and everything's in these like cool tones. And the Maitlands come back as they went to the netherworld, come back to discover their house has been altered, and they're so appalled. And on one level, I always understood like this was their home and their home is being invaded and altered without their consent. And like, that's upsetting. I get that. And on another level, I was like, yes, but it looks so much better now. Like, I don't know that I would decorate quite like that now, but certainly if I had to pick one extreme or the other, I would 100% hire Delia Dietz to decorate my house before I hired the Maitlands.
It is that pureness and naivete and unassuming aspect of the Maitlands home, and then this, I don't want to say oppressive force, but this very aggressive remodeling and change of aesthetic. I think it was either Tim Burton's like version of like gothy futurism, abstract, because it doesn't exist in real life unless you try it to make it look like that. And I think that the reason it potentially even feels that much more invasive is because you're meant to identify with the Maitlands, but then you realize maybe you're stranger than you thought. maybe you haven't realized that you've chosen a side, similar maybe to the Addams family, so where you haven't realized that you've been welcomed to a slightly darker perspective. But to that end, Delia isn't even Delia's an artist, but played by the great Catherine O'Hara, of course. She's not necessarily dark and gloomy. She's not a Morticia. She's not even all that. She's sort of like poser.
Oh, very much. She thinks of herself as an artist. Mm-hmm. The occult obviously becomes a major part of the story as the people in the living world start to learn about the ghosts. And she very much sort of gloms on to the idea of ghosts because they're trendy.
Right. It's capitalism. She finds a way to commodify her misery living in the country.
Yeah. Yeah, what is her line? If you don't let me gut out this house and make it my own, I will
go insane and I will take you with me.
Yeah. Oh, and it's that ramping. Like, I'm not even going to try and do it because I know I can't.
No, it just
can't live up to Catherine O'Hara, but like that, like ramping, like you can see the insanity cresting as she's talking about it.
Ghosts. You're telling me we have ghosts in this house? Those are pictures of ghosts. Are they? Ghosts. Lydia, I am giving a dinner party tonight for 7 people. My agent Bernard is bringing a woman who writes for art in America. In fact, no one dining here this evening has not been in Vanity Fair, except you.
Told him you were too mean to be afraid.
Don't you dare speak to others about me. The only thing that scares me is being embarrassed in front of the few hip people I can get to set foot in this part of Connecticut. So let's play family just for tonight.
One of the characters that does not get necessarily as much discussion as some of the others is Winona Ryder's character, who is really the driving force. It's her curiosity that continues the narrative. Can you tell me a little bit about your relationship with Lydia?
So it's interesting. I think it's developed a lot over the years. As a kid, Lydia in the movie, yes, she had this very sort of like dour gothic appearance, and she was very sad, right? She was a deeply depressed character, but that's all you really know about her, right? Like you learn that she likes photography because it's a plot point.
She's holding a camera. Yeah.
Right. And she takes the photo later of the Maitlands and realizes that, oh, they don't have feet. And then that's when she starts to like realize that she's seeing ghosts, right? It's a plot point. Could you tell me anything else about her? She doesn't get a lot of character development. And so even though she's got these couple of like very notable things to hang the character on, in a lot of ways, she's a blank slate. And I think it's because you're meant, even more so than the Maitlands, to see yourself in her, right?
She's our guide. Yeah,
exactly. And so I think she's very intentionally a blank slate kind of character. And then, of course, again, the cartoon version where she's much more a main character, right? She's the star of that show. Like she and Beetlejuice are the main characters of that show, and they go on zany 1980s cartoon adventures. And so you learn a lot more about her, and she gets a lot more characterization there, but it's not the same. Like they're different pieces of canon. They're not actually related. And then honestly, for me, the thing that made her the most interesting and sympathetic character was the musical. You get a lot, you get to hear about her mother's death and why she's depressed in the musical. Like the musical sets them moving to the countryside a couple of months after her mother's death. And they've actually rewritten the character of Delia in ways that make a lot of sense for the narrative, but also make me sad because I don't like her as much anymore. They've rewritten her, like I said, in a way that makes a lot of sense for the narrative. She's no longer Charles's wife and Lydia's stepmom. She's now a like life coach that Charles has hired to help bring Lydia out of her depression, except Delia is herself this very like desperate, hanging on by a thread, like believes in crystal healing and chakras, because if she doesn't believe in them, if there isn't some order to the universe, then what has everything been about? And there is she and Charles are romantically involved, but they're hiding it from Lydia because her mom just died a couple months ago. Like it's a whole thing.
It sounds like it may have been somewhat inspired by the play and movie Blithe Spirit, if you're familiar.
I am not.
There was a play named called Blithe Spirit. It's been made into a movie twice, at least. Yeah, it's basically about a couple where they hire a medium, because back in the day, what you do is you would hire a medium for fun and games. It'd be like that, or fox hunting, when rich people have money to spend.
We only two options for entertainment.
And they find that the husband's first love is still around or has come back, and she creates drop dead Fred moments for the rest of the film. But Madame Arcarte, who I do not remember who played her in the film, but Angela Lansbury played her on Broadway, so that should give you some indication of the type of character. She's very much like, ooh, let me get my crystals. And she is, suspicious vintage as a psychic. So
that's fair. Yeah, the musical version of Delia is, like I said, just sort of desperate for something that gives her life meaning. And so she latches on to everything. There's a great line. There's a song between her and Lydia where she's trying to like tell her like the universe has a plan and everything's going to be fine and nothing happens for no reason. And Lydia's telling her that no, actually everything is random. That's how the universe works. And somewhere in there, Delia has a line, "Crystals speak to me." And Lydia says, "Yeah? What do they say?" And Delia's answer is, "Buy more crystals." And it's such a great encapsulation of that sort of like, and I say this as like a Wiccan priestess, a white lady, right? But it's such a great encapsulation of that sort of like white lady spiritualism that we see sometimes of like trying to find something, anything to hold on to in that regard.
It's interesting also, the film is very notable for following a trend that we, for some reason, as human beings, love to include, which is sort of, I think it's referred to as celestial bureaucracy, which is basically pencil pushing in the afterlife. Yes. The whole concept of you become a civil servant, particularly if you've committed suicide, is sort of a fascinating, like there's so much lore clearly that couldn't make it into the movie. Yeah, but it's all written down somewhere, and I would love to see. I don't know. I've not explored it if there are deleted scenes, alternate takes, or anything like that, because it wouldn't surprise me if Tim Burton did all of that and the studio was like, we really kind of have to get to Beetlejuice faster. Because there's a lot. It's like a D&D sheet, a campaign. There's so much backstory and how the undead and how the dead communicate with the rest of the other dead through Juno and everything else. And if we knew then what we know now, we wouldn't perhaps have had our little accident.
Yes, 100% agree with you on that. And I think that if there's deleted scenes, I don't know them. Like the version of the DVD I have, the version of the movie I have doesn't have really any special features at all. Like it's just the movie. And I don't know if the people who wrote the musical maybe had some insight into what that original lore was, or if this was just them kind of brainstorming what things could be like. But it holds on to that idea of the bureaucracy. It functions a little differently because it's a different medium of storytelling, and the story itself is slightly altered and all of these things. But Juno's still in there. Miss Argentina is still in there. All of that still applies.
Bella, do you have any final thoughts about your relationship with potentially Beetlejuice?
That my dining room is themed Beetlejuice. Yeah. I mean, it was one of those movies that once as well, grew up loving it, grew up watching it, was able to quote it, did the TikToks. If I couldn't make this house my own, I'll go insane and I'll take you with me. And it's funny, like the whole thing, once again, the whole thing with becoming a civil servant, it reminds me of like certain things, like in regards to almost it's very similar to like with like Judaism, we don't believe in hell. Mm. So it's one of those, like, if we have our own little accident, will that happen to us? Kind of thing. And that was something that, believe it or not, growing up, like, once again, best friends with my grandma, we had that discussion when we watched that movie. Is that if something like that happened, would that happen to us, kind of thing? And I remember having discussions like that with my grandma. And once again, we love Michael Keaton. And it's funny, he wasn't even in the movie that long.
I think 17 minutes. I think 17, less than 20. Yeah, less than 20 minutes.
But it's funny. I loved the Maitlands. I remember watching that movie and I loved the Maitlands, and I felt so bad for them the entire time. But I loved what the Dietzes did with the house. I remember the entire time I wanted, and the funny thing is my family thought I was fucking bonkers because I wanted the sculptures and I wanted them as my pets. I wanted the sculptures and I wanted them as my pets. But I felt bad for the Maitlands. That's one thing I remember. And I was like the entire time with the puppy. And I remember with the car, and then the dog jumped off, and then all that crap happened. My first response was, "Oh no, is the dog okay?"
Yes.
The dog is okay. Tim Burton does not usually kill the dog, or if he does, he brings him back in some capacity. As a final note, I want to give love to Otho, who is Glenn Shaddix, who is no longer with us. But one of my favorite pieces of trivia about him, in addition to the fact that he plays a transvestite trumpet player in the Golden Girls, when he died in September 2010, at his funeral they played Deo. I think that's a lovely moment.
Come, Mr. Tallyman, tally me banana.
Daylight come and we want go home.
Live
6 foot, 7 foot, 8 foot bunch. Daylight come and we want go home. 6 foot, 7 foot, 8 foot bunch. Daylight come and we want go home.
day is a day, oh.
Daylight come and we want go home.
Day is a day, is a day, is a day.
Daylight come